Architecture is an important part of any application, especially if you have to maintain it long term and do patches and modifications as customers want additional features. So in this section, we're going to focus on what architecture patterns does AngularJS actually make available to us. And the answer to that question is there's two main ones you could pick out, and you could probably even argue that others are used as well. But I'm going to focus on two here. The first is Model View Controller, or MVC. And then the second is something called Model View View Model, or MVVM. Now, if you're new to patterns, really all they are is much along the lines of a cookie cutter pattern, such as the one you can see over here to the right. And what they do is provide some guidance, really prescriptive guidance, that can be used to build our applications. So instead of just coding away and kind of randomly adding code in, we can actually follow this guidance to build some more solid applications. Now, when you put MVC and MVVM together, you'll get what we like to call MV star. And this is a popular term that a lot of websites and frameworks use nowadays. And really what it means is that we have kind of a blended approach where the application architecture is a combination of multiple patterns. But when it comes to MVC and MVVM, let's take a look at how they fit in to Angular and how it actually uses them. So when a request comes in, a controller is actually going to be instantiated. And this will be an AngularJS controller, of course, written in JavaScript. As mentioned earlier in the course, really the controller is like the brain for a given view. Now, the controller is responsible for perhaps processing business logic, grabbing data, and performing some types of other operations. So it might perform some type of an operation to go out and get data, which we're going to call the model. And then once it gets that data, it needs to store it somewhere. And where we store it in the AngularJS world is in what's called the scope. Now the scope, which will be injected into the controller, you'll see shortly, is actually going to have the properties for the data that we want to expose to the view. So the view doesn't actually directly interact with the controller when it comes to data binding. It actually goes through the scope. And then the scope, of course, has its properties set or values of those properties set through the controller. Now the view, of course, then is rendered back to the browser. So from the MVC type of pattern, Model View Controller, we do have a model, we do have a controller, and we have a view. Now the Model View View Model, or MVVM that we see up here, we have a model and we have a view, but what's the view model? And if you're new to that term, really what view model means is it's the view's data, you could say, or the view's model. So in this case, the scope is actually the view model if you've used that type of pattern. Now normally we don't really call it the view model, we just call it the scope, although you can call it whatever you want. But you can see in going through this analogy here that we have MVC components and we have MVVM components, and AngularJS kind of follows this MV star type of approach. So that's a quick look at how architecture fits in and some of the components that satisfy these architectures. So now what we're going to do in the remaining sections of this module is go through some of these different pieces, such as the controller and the scope, and we'll learn how to tie that into the view.